Guys, you're coming to a lecture on fiction. The entire movie of The Mummy has just been
but Game of Thrones is a lot more contemporary.
Game of Thrones is pretty, like, current. A lot of people into it.
Just to check, could you perhaps like give us a
If you do not want any of Game of Thrones spoiled for you, you can
It's Game of Thrones.
How about the first whole series aside? The whole series.
There are quite a few spoilers. However, if you've spent any time on the internet at all,
you've seen it.
You've seen.
Okay, so yes, there are Game of Thrones spoilers.
Are you spoiling the 5th book?
You've spent a year.
No, not
Okay.
quite.
No book spoilers.
Nothing past the TV series.
Yeah, we can go with that.
That's fine. The TV series gets boring.
And it's not just Game of Thrones.
So wait, what other spoilers are in then?
A few things.
Would
have been nice if you had said something.
Anyway, my talk is going to be on things that we expect to happen and why it's always fun when they don't. So often when reading fiction, we've got little narratives in our heads and scripts about what we expect to happen, how we think things will play out. And so we get things like this. And then...
nothing's showing up.
That jolly well should have. Damn it. We get things like this.
Well, I expected something to happen and something else did.
That's irony.
And then when the story doesn't work out quite that way, it has a much stronger emotional kick.
Because you're something but inevitable betrayal!
However, recently a number of authors, especially in science fiction and fantasy, have been playing on this and moving away from a lot of the traditional narratives that we have, not least of which the idea that the hero wins, and instead are removing some of the invulnerabilities and sureties that we've been used to seeing. So instead of a main character that we know and love and can rest safely in the knowledge that they are protected by plot armor, we get this, and
We
this.
can't see it.
So we get this, and this,
Oh, you're a bad man.
and this.
Me.
Cool.
Bad man.
Now, characters dying is nothing new. It's been a recognised way of symbolising that a series is going through a major transition in the plot, or that it's getting much darker and edgier, for quite some time. However, I'd argue that what we're seeing right now is something a little bit different. Rather than using character death as a sort of big symbol that happens once in a series, a number of authors are trying to create what they consider to be much more realistic consequences, and not so much making characters die to make a point in the series, but allowing the characters to die if that is the logical consequence of some particular piece of stupidity that the character has undertaken. What makes this really interesting, as more than just cool things in literary conventions, is that it also helps us understand a lot about what happens in our heads with the scripts we have in everyday life. The social structures and expectations that we get when we're talking to other people, when we're interacting with ideas in politics, things like that. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So, I'm going to start with a couple of brief examples of the altered approach of what authors are trying to do and what they've said they're trying to do. Mostly Game of Thrones, because that's something that I can be reasonably sure you'll all be familiar with. And then move into a more general discussion of some of the theory that sits behind this, and also some of what I think are the interesting, possibly worrying, but possibly really useful applications of some of these ideas. The obvious example is, of course, George R.R. Martin. But there are a couple of others. Scott Lynch has written a series not too long ago called The Gentleman Bastards. Starts with the lives of Locke Lamora. A number of you may not have read it, I thoroughly recommend it, but again, it's a series where rather than nice, simple, black and white morality, there is sort of no obvious good character. There's also not necessarily the same sort of obvious main character. And the consequences 4 different characters from their actions do not follow our standard expectations in those ways. It's well worth looking at. Similarly, Jennifer Fallon's Second Sons trilogy, well worth getting into. Similar in some ways to Death Note, if you're familiar with the ideas of a couple of really, really clever people spending a lot of time trying to outsmart each other. It's glorious to read, and mostly it's just full of snarky comments. Now, what Martin has said, and repeatedly demonstrated, is that he's not interested so much in particular endings and carving out particular niches for the sake of those niches, but in creating interesting characters, and then letting the characters loose to see what would happen with that. In some ways that idea is not especially new. Ursula Le Guin did some similar things in science fiction in the late 20th century. She often described having to wait a while so that she could let one of her worlds mature and then come back and see what had happened, which I really hope is a metaphor, that or she's got a good portal gun somewhere. But the main concept being that she had to actually play out the interactions and see what would logically occur. But for the most part, that's not what most authors have described as trying to do in the past. Now, where are we? Oh yes. Instead, there's a focus on realism and an assumption that realism is dark and gritty. And I am looking in large parts at the dark and gritty bits, but mostly just because that demonstrates my point well. Sometimes though, that doesn't necessarily have to mean dark and edgier is more real in any way. It can just mean that it's something that is unexpected because of what we assume is likely to happen, rather than unexpected because it doesn't make sense. So, if we go back to the Red Wedding for a moment...
Don't need to manage these?
Sorry. What we should expect is exactly this. However, instead of looking at this and going, a naive young king who, having a hard enough time trying to win a fight and convincing people to take him seriously, does something stupid by breaking an alliance with a powerful ally, the probable thing that should happen from here is that he dies and loses horribly. That's what, if you think about it from an international relations perspective, a power perspective, any kind of politics, that's what you'd expect. But in literature, the Red Wedding is unexpected. It takes readers and viewers by surprise because we assume that Rob is the main character, we assume he's the hero, we assume that somehow he has to get out of this because we've been taught basically from birth that the hero wins, that the hero makes it through. And this means that when we see the Red Wedding, it not only has a powerful kick because we care about Rob, but also because it's unexpected, which gives it shock value. And the shock value heightens any emotion it's associated with. It's not so much an emotion in and of itself, which is why people who are in shock often just sort of freeze. They're not doing anything, because it's not an emotion by itself in that sense, but it intensifies any emotion that it's around. So if someone is angry and shocked, then the anger is much more explosive. If they're sad and they're shocked, then the resulting depression is much, much more intense. So authors have been using that a lot more to create this break and this power. And, sorry, too many notes. And I would argue that this is different. What is different now is that before, when people have used shocking detail and lots of blood and death to tell a story, that's been making a point rather than allowing it to happen. So if we contrast George R.R. Martin's book with Peter F. Hamilton's Night's Dawn trilogy, which starts with reality dysfunction. This series has so much blood in it, so much gore, so much absolute horror, that it makes Game of Thrones look like child's play. It is sufficiently graphic and awful that even were I able to find images of it, I wouldn't, because it's at about that level of unpleasantness. Excellent series, I thoroughly recommend people read it, but, but you know, be warned. But at the same time, in this, the heroes always make it through. There are miraculous saves, miraculous rescues. They never quite cross into the realm of Deus Ex Machina, though it's jolly close, since the last book is called The Naked God. But they still have to spend the first 3 chapters or so explaining why the hero has latent psychic powers and why this makes him just unimaginably lucky in order to justify his subsequent miraculous escapes on numerous occasions, which makes sense in the context of the book, but that's still basically a way of giving him plot armour. And instead of that, we see with Game of Thrones that there are no miracles for Robb Stark. Now, while George R.R. Martin's primary goal is not to shock audiences, I maintain it's not his primary goal, he's certainly aware of the effect that it has. So this leads us to the question of exactly why do these narratives have so much power? Why is it so shocking for us when these narratives break? Well, on one level, the short answer is that we care about the characters, so when they die, it's sad. But the much more sophisticated and complex answer is that when it has to do with the nature of trope theory, if you're familiar with that in literature, and social structures, which I will now briefly get into. So, the basic idea of what a trope is that it's a literary or filmic convention or character archetype which gives us a pattern that we can recognise. It tells audiences roughly what they expect to happen in a story. And that's very useful for authors because it also gives them a pattern they can follow which they know audiences will accept as basically plausible. There's a pattern of events which an audience reading a book or watching a series will go, yes, okay, that makes sense, I understand it, I see where this is going, I'm happy with this. For example, if a villain falls off a cliff and you never find the body, you know he's coming back in the next season. Except, of course, for Gollum. Now, authors, so it can be very useful for authors to do that. They don't have to. They can instead try to create something genuinely new, though that's a little bit difficult. But, so instead, a lot of the time, what you see is authors doing new takes on old ideas. So they take the old pattern, they change little bits of it, but they keep the broad outline. And this is what we call a trope. Something we see again and again across series, across formats, because it helps. And then so this can be considered a kind of social structure. Now, exactly what a social structure is defined as in sociology and political science is disputed. There's a lot of debate, a lot of very heavy jargon in that. For me, though, the easiest way to understand it is to consider it basically a trope, but in a much broader context. Yes. A social structure is essentially what society uses to keep things neat and tidy and ordered, which in part is by keeping people under control. So, when you get on a bus, for example, there's a very clear, simple narrative. We all line up, we get on, we present our My Way cards to the reader, it beeps, we sit down, we sit in absolute silence, not talking to the people around us, and it's totally awkward, but everyone's much happier that way, allegedly. Yeah, inevitably there'll be someone who either has no credit on their My Way card, or tries to pay with a $50 bill, or something like that. And this challenges the expected story. It creates a tension moment, it creates stress. And then you can feel the atmosphere on the bus suddenly tense up. It's much more on edge. It's a very small example, but it demonstrates the phenomenon that whenever you break a social structure, whenever you go against the expected norm, people get very tense. Which is why a lot of the policies that Action has for its bus drivers is about what do you do in this situation. And usually the bus driver just says, right, okay, forget it this time, just sit down, because that makes the tension go away. It makes everything neat and smooth again. It removes the social danger, which is really important for maintaining a functional society. And, okay. And this then helps everyone operate, because as social beings, both evolutionarily and psychologically, we rely on these structures, and we've been taught to rely on these structures since birth, pretty much. Because without them, you can't work with other people. You've got no way of communicating, you've got no way of trusting, you've got no means of cooperating. So they're quite good and quite useful, even though at times they can become problematic. And because we rely on them, because we need them so much, people cling to them quite desperately, even when a lot of those structures are no longer quite useful anymore, or at least not as useful as they might otherwise be. If you want an example of this, take a look at the paid parental leave schemes being proposed now, and the fact that they're consistently called paid maternity leave schemes, which is a very small thing, but it conveys a lot of underlying attitude, because that is a particular structure and a particular set of assumptions that certain groups are clinging to incredibly hard. And the more threatened a group feels, the more strongly it clings to its social structures. Same thing that happens with tropes. If an author... sorry. And what this... To then slowly wind this back towards Game of Thrones, when you're in a series where you already feel slightly threatened because you've had Ned die, had Rob die, suddenly you're clinging much, much more closely to Oberyn Martell. So when he inevitably dies, it's even more tense because you've had to cling to your expectation and your hope that one of these heroes will eventually live so much harder. And Tyrion's kind of cool, so that's just sad. Now, where I find this really cool, where for me this becomes really powerful, is when you take it beyond simply literature and you start looking at wider society with these scripts. Because what these scripts do is that if we see the first 4 instances of a pattern, we expect the 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, you expect a 5. Or if in literature you've had boy meets girl or some other combination thereof, they immediately dislike each other, they spend 3 books bickering constantly while saving the world. You expect that in book 4 there will be some romance subplot in which they get together. It's the pattern that we recognise, and authors can use that to hide things or change things, but mostly we end up not looking for other plots because we're expecting that plot so strongly. So if at the same time that we're expecting this clearly set up romance plot between the 2 main characters, instead one of the other characters comes through and becomes the new love interest for one of those characters, often we don't notice that for quite a while, and authors can hide that quite well because we're expecting a totally different romance plot. So even when there are giant neon signs saying it's not these 2 anymore, people will not necessarily notice that as much. And that can be quite useful for an author, but quite dangerous in society. And the example I want to go with for that tonight is the not all men controversy. And it is an area which I am aware is very loaded and very sensitive, so I will try to be even-handed and sensible in my critiques. Because I personally feel that both sides are quite missing the point in this. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the basic idea is that a number of quite well-informed, quite well-researched feminist critiques have been put forward recently. It's gaining a lot more momentum at the moment because the internet does help give certain groups a voice, which is good, and they'll put forth indisputable statistics about relative pay, relative housework loads, and the quite apparent gendered oppression is the correct word in this context that still exists in our society today. Not explicitly in words, but very clearly in actions. To which the reply is often, yes, but not all men do this. And understandably, a number of people who've been making these critiques get quite angry about this, because it comes across as a denial of all of the weight of evidence and data on the basis that, well, there are some exceptions, so we'll only care about the exceptions. And this is the not all men idea. The critique of the not all men idea is that it misses the point of the weight of data, because it's not, the point is not that all men are evil or all men are scumbags, or even that most men are consciously involved in gender depression, but that the way society is structured now means that going about business as usual constitutes supporting an unequal set of structures. And therefore, even if there are exceptions, that does not deny the basic point. And that's fair enough to say that the point is being missed there. I would also say, though, that those critiques equally miss the point of the people who are saying not all men. Because when I read those arguments, to me what that says is someone is feeling under attack, and they are trying to say, look, we want to help. We care enough about what you are saying that we feel ashamed of what you are saying, which makes us feel threatened. So if you continually say and use very general terms in the critiques of the gendered society, then that comes across as an attack on all men, even when it's not supposed to be. And many of the feminist critiques have not recognised that, which means that both sides are missing the point of what the other is saying. Now, my belief on why they're missing the point is that they're not listening to exactly what is being said. They're listening to the first few words and then extrapolating the pattern from there. So the not all men response has been offered, has been a response even to much more carefully worded feminist critiques, which quite clearly state, we are aware that not every man does this. We are aware that most men do not consciously think of themselves as better than women. And this is still the structure that we see. Yet the not all men response is still offered to that, which means that the people making that response haven't heard the we are aware that this is not everybody, we are aware that this is not the conscious effort. But likewise, the absence of the engagement with what does not all men actually mean from the perspective of the people saying that suggests that, again, a particular group of a particular kind of feminist is not listening to what is actually being said about the we understand what you're saying, we agree that what you are saying is bad and should change, and we feel under attack. They are simply hearing an argument back and assuming that it is an argument that denies everything that they are saying and denies any reality to the inequality that they're talking about. This becomes an enormous problem because when you've got two groups that are just not listening to each other, that are actually agreeing on the basic idea, which is that equality is good, I think your ordinary person would agree. Equality is good. At least in a Western society. That's usually not a contested statement. Usually. The fact that they continue to butt heads on something where they don't necessarily actually disagree, but because they're not listening, they don't realise that they agree on the core elements, that prevents any kind of progress, that prevents any kind of meaningful discourse, that alienates an enormous number of people who might otherwise be supporting your cause from both sides, which creates the kind of thing that you see at the moment where there's currently a social media campaign running with a whole lot of young women holding up placards saying, I don't need feminism because, and then describing a lot of things that have nothing to do with feminism, but it's what they think feminism is, because they've only been presented with a narrative that is incredibly destructive and incredibly violent, and that is much more along the lines of hating men rather than promoting equality. And you can only get a social media campaign like that where you've got people that aren't listening to what is being actually said. So that is something that I think would be really quite important to change. So while we have wandered quite far from Game of Thrones, this is exactly where I had wanted to end up. So thank you all for sticking with it. Any questions? Yep.
I actually have a serious contribution for us. The argument, or that argument, makes enough sense. However, I think it would perhaps also be a tiny bit idealistic and or naive to suggest that the substance of both arguments there is always going to actually be something intelligent that just isn't being listened to. Because this is the internet, and about 70% of it is just going to be, like, almost amusingly obnoxious and really narrow-minded and extremely rude and probably filled with slurs and things that they've done to your mum. So
absolutely.
But again, some of literature is like that.
And I would absolutely agree. And I would actually, and I would state that that is a major contributor to the phenomenon that I've been trying to describe, because if you know that you're wading through the sea of filth that is the internet, and that there are going to be an awful lot of responses that are just your mum's so fat, or whatever the current insult is, then you put up filters so that you can ignore that, so you can just skim past it. So you're only reading the first 3 words rather than the actual substance of the argument. And if something looks like an ignorant, uninformed, stupid, rude comment, then you just ignore it and brush past it and assume that it is exactly like the narrative that you expect in your head. So I agree, there is absolutely a lot of stuff on the internet that is not constructive, that is not useful, and that's part of why a lot of this phenomenon is becoming so powerful and so visible on the internet at the moment, because it is now so easy and so common to not read through. That's what TLDR is about. It means that you haven't read through it, you've just assumed that you understand it from the first couple of sentences.
So with that in mind, you'd say that both sides of the argument are engaging with the worst that the other side has to offer?
Yeah. And assuming that all that the other side has to offer is equal to the worst that it has to offer.
So it's basically kind of like beginning to read a decent fantasy novel and assuming Twilight.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's depressing.
That's insulting.
Yeah.
So bad.
I don't know, I read Tumblr sometimes.
So Zach, with the Game of Thrones character killing off activities, I mean, isn't it partly when you read a novel that you want to see a character sort of grow and develop? And it's really what they do is only secondary to the fact that it's a story about a person. So if we get too used to the idea that people are going to get knocked off at any moment, we lose our attachment to people, which is one of the reasons, which is more interesting than the actual plot, quite often.
Possibly. And what you're saying is absolutely right. Most modern fiction, and hard to put a start date on it, but probably from about the Romantics onward, or arguably the Shakespearean theatres onward, is very much character focused. Before that, characters are very shallow and archetypal, so that appears to be much more about events and actions, but now I would agree with you. And I think that's where it becomes important to think about some of the caveats that are being put around the killing of characters. Martin has said that when he kills characters, he doesn't kill characters purely just to kill characters. And for him, it is absolutely about the characters. So there have been a lot of interesting female characters in Game of Thrones. There have also been a lot of Sansa, who has spent most of the books being annoying and pointless and a waste of space, which is exactly what her society has made her into, so it shouldn't surprise anyone. But
She's starting to develop.
So she's starting to develop.
In the books.
But the main thing that he says he's doing there is he's actively not trying to write strong female characters. He is not trying to write any particular type of female character. He's trying to write an interesting character, and if this character is female in this given social setting, and they are interesting as a person, how will they go? So what he sees the current challenge as is, alright, given realistic consequences, given a setting in which a lot of people are likely to die, because anything that's attempting to approximate medieval Europe or pre-medieval Europe, so Dark Ages, lots of people die a lot if you're doing that realistically. So given a high mortality, how can you make characters interesting enough that people will still want to read that? So I would agree to an extent, but I think there are ways past that. There are ways where you can still go, this is a sufficiently interesting story, these are sufficiently interesting people, that you can keep an audience engaged.
Long enough to kill their favourite characters.
But then you find,
is alive.
but everyone finds a new favourite character.
Briefly.
I mean, look at the Tyrion fandom at the moment.
Oh yeah, but that is an interesting comment, because something that I've noticed looking through assorted fora is that there were a lot of people who latched on to Ned Stark as the clear hero right at the beginning. Then he dies. So they latch on to Robb as the clear hero, and then he dies. And then they latch on to a couple of different people actually. A number of them have forgiven Jamie for shoving Bran out the window, and so they've latched onto him.
So
Or-
Cersei.
I don't think anyone really likes Cersei.
Or they've latched onto Tyrion.
She was in the Terminator.
And among book readers, a number of them have actually started latching on to Cersei as an interesting character. Because no. In the series,
You've read the book.
in the TV series, she's still fairly shallowly presented. There's not been a lot of interesting development for her in the TV series. There's been a lot more that happens in the books, which is quite interesting.
They start to pity her, but you don't.
Yes, there's pity, but people then start looking at her as a character that they want to know more about.
I guess.
And you do see that succession of characters to which they attach, regardless of whether or not these characters are good, respectable, in any way decent human beings, or have the slightest shred of a conscience.
I think you mean
They latch
protagonists
onto them as interesting.
rather than heroes.
Yeah, protagonists maybe, but
Like
heroes
Voldemort
definitely
as a
not.
character.
I thought Martin had actually set out a couple of years ago
Oh,
the express goal of filling an artificial lake with the tears of his fan base. Even so, I think
He has succeeded.
well, with mention of years though, I suspect part of this is probably got to be the fact that Game of Thrones is a series now, or A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series, has been going since 1996.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time for, and let me tell you, the reader base has to dissect the entire series again and again and again.
Yes, but they still always turn out totally wrong.
Yes, which is great. But I mean,
And-
do you think time plays a major is a major player in getting people to attach to different characters?
I would, and I think the example our generation can best relate to is Harry Potter, in that for us those books came out at the perfect time. So those books came out for most of us when we were in primary school, or possibly just about to go into it if you're ridiculously young like Oscar here. And then as we grew older, so did the characters in that book. So the way we related to those characters changed, and the characters who we found interesting changed, so that we started being willing to engage with different characters in different ways. So I'd say that that time phenomenon is absolutely true. And you see that in any really long-running fantasy series, not least because the author just gets better as a writer.
Don't tell that to the fifth book.
I like
We don't talk about the fifth.
I liked it.
Once you get out of House Black, it's good.
Yeah, and you then get things like in Wheel of Time. The first couple of books move quite quickly. Then you've got books 4 and 5, which are unreadable tomes because he hasn't yet developed as a writer. By the end of it, he's a much, much better writer. So,
29 books.
Precisely. So he's gotten better as a writer, and the characters have changed because a lot's happened, and characters do change when things happen. So you're looking at different characters, and because you're a different reader, you're looking for different things in characters. So where Harry was sort of interesting and you could relate to him when you were 8, 9, 10, when he was in book 1 of the Harry Potter series, in book 5 he just becomes an annoying prat because he's going through his angsty teenage phase, and everyone's an annoying prat when they're in their angsty teenage phase.
I would argue.
There's that realism thing to talk about.
I would argue that you would relate to Harry because he's the least interesting character in the entire series.
I relate to him because we're both secretly wizards.
That's the thing. He is the least, as an older reader when you come to it, he is the least interesting character. Far and away the least interesting character. When you're younger, you're willing to engage with him because he's the main character to whom everyone happens, and as a younger reader, that's potentially a lot more of what you're interested in. So he's not boring and uninteresting and the least interesting character when you're 8 or 9.
You can talk to snakes. How cool is that?
Yeah.
It's also become a common, it's become a common thing that the central character is not actually the main point. They're like the running thread. So, like, it's how many TV shows and stuff and books are there where the character's there and you've got your central main main characters, and they're not the ones that people love the most.
It's like
It's the peripheral characters they love.
Luke
Like,
Skywalker was Han
One
Solo.
one of the classic examples of this is
Chewie.
from TV is NCIS, where the main character is trying to solve the mysteries. It's a very predictable show. The same thing basically happens every week. But Abby
And
is
you
really,
want to
really
kill
cool.
the science writers.
Yes, yes, yes.
You do want to kill
You do want to
Solo.
kill
But
science
the main
writers.
point though is that Abby is really cool because she's this creepy goth chick who knows sign languages, sort of different actual languages,
Sleeps in a
spoken
coffin.
languages, sleeps in a coffin, and has all of these things. And she's just kind of cool. So you end up watching NCIS just for Abby rather than for the rest of it.
well, I mean, like How I Met Your Mother has like Ted's meant to be the main character.
Oh,
He's so dull. He's
dull.
such an
And then
idiot.
he's just like he's there, and then everyone's like Barney.
Yeah,
and
but
it was
I
the
mean,
same thing like a decade earlier with Will and Grace. You had Will and Grace as the central, and everyone started loving
Jack.
Well,
Jack.
I suppose
What about Bart Simpson?
you actually saw a very similar thing in
I hate Bart
CSI
Simpson.
Miami, where a lot of the side characters became the main show, and the main characters were sidelined.
The best representation of this I've ever seen is in The Emperor's New Groove, where at one point Emperor Cusco just has to pause the film, pull down a slide, and grab a red pen, saying, "I'm the main character, not him," because the side character has become absolutely the point of the movie.
Excuse me, for Loki.
Yes,
Loki, absolutely. Or Black Widow in any of those movies.
That's true.
Yeah. I know a couple of guys who looked at those movies and went, "Damn, we want to learn how to do those kicks." And the neck break with the legs. One of them figured out how to do it as well.
I'm just wondering about like the thing that's become kind of popular in literature is, I guess, probably over the last 20 years more so, I'd say, of writing characters that everyone hates, but like not just a character, like
All the characters.
the whole character. So like the slap is like I got a third of the way into it and I couldn't keep going because I get heavily invested in what I'm reading, and those characters drew like I hated them, and they're meant to be written that way, and it's written really well, so I hate them.
I had that with Wuthering Heights.
I liked
I hated Wuthering Heights. It just there was nothing redeeming about any of those characters, and it was awful.
I find that
What did you do
tends
about
to
that?
be very much a function of what is the author trying to do with the book. The slap is a very good example because the slap is trying to ask a couple of questions about how society operates. Almost not so much on the idea of corporal punishment, though that is a part of it, but also just in terms of how relationships operate in certain circumstances. So, since it is a highly critical book, and critical in this sense not so much in the idea of picking apart assumptions as much as saying, "You people all suck." In that sense, and where authors are making that kind of point, I agree that is something that we've seen, and I would also agree that things like Wuthering Heights have done that before. Dickens, likewise, had a lot of characters that you just didn't like and you wanted to suffer because they were stupid and not doing the sorts of things that they should have been doing. They were not taking opportunities that they were given, and Dickens was actively criticising them for that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's new. I would say that that's resurgent.
More common, I guess. Is
Yeah,
where
perhaps
I
more
would
common than
like
it's been
It's become
recently.
fairly
Yeah.
like you had authors that did
Yeah.
it at points.
It's, I would agree that it is resurgent. The end of the Cold War is probably not coincidental with that. A lot of us no longer actually think about the Cold War when we think about what is driving certain societal changes, but it is well worth noting that the rate of social change and the rate of movement on social issues increased markedly after the end of the Cold War, probably because there was scope to do it, and there was scope to make criticisms of society without being labelled in quite simplistic terms as being just too left. Now, this is not to dismiss the excellent work that was done, I'll get to you in just a moment. This is not to dismiss the excellent work that was done in the civil rights era. Enormous gains were made, and yet when you look at a lot of the numbers from, say, 1970 to 1990, there's not a lot of change. there's a lot of change in certain discourses in certain very specific areas as a result of the civil rights movement, and then there's an awful lot of stagnation in the West from about 1970 onwards, which is not exclusively due to the Cold War, but the Cold War would make sense as a large part of what hampers social change.
I reckon we could probably hold an XSAC that was devoted entirely to whether or not that was causation or correlation. However, what I was going to make a point on was the earlier discussion. If you look at an incredibly popular series like the Harry Flashman series, which is written entirely around a protagonist who is as much of a...
Just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Harry Flashman is a series, about 12, 13 books, of historical fiction set in the twilight years of the British Empire.
No, starting years.
It's Second British Empire.
Yeah.
So it starts with the Indian Mutiny, which is about 1830, and then goes until about 1890, looking at all of these events that the British Empire were involved in through the eyes of Harry Flashman. Harry Flashman is a character taken from one of the great works of schoolboy fiction from set in the 19th century, which is Tom Brown's School Days. Some of you may have heard of that. Flashman was the bully in that. He was the enemy who Tom Brown eventually vanquishes, as the classic hero will, thanks to his plot armour. Or, get the pulp beaten out of him if it's George R.R. Martin writing. Anyway, Flashman comes from that, and he's a bastard.
Yeah, basically the series became really, really popular about 15 years ago, I think, which is sort of impressive because Flashman is a completely irredeemable prick. For at least about the first 10 books of the series, he is absolutely horrid. He will happily murder friends for personal gain. He will chuck absolutely anyone he can under the bus to save his own hide. He's a complete coward, an absolute lecherous pig. And through more or less strokes of not usually genius, almost inevitably luck, everyone thinks he's a war hero. But I think it just proves that attachment is not necessarily related to whether or not we like the character.
But does he have style?
Yes, that's the thing. That is absolutely the thing. He has style, he has panache, but most importantly, he's funny as fuck.
Does he have grace?
No, he does not have grace. He does not have grace. He has charm in the way that Tip's fedora appears to have charm when you first meet them. When you first meet them, then you realise that they're a fedora guy and you run away. So he is well educated and he's reasonably clever, but mostly he's an asshole. And he says all of these assholish things that everyone wants to say but isn't allowed to say. Also, he's just funny. Really, really funny.
It's kind of like Sterling Archer, but in...
I don't know Sterling Archer.
Well, I mean, he's not nearly,
don't worry.
not nearly as competent as Sterling Archer.
Yeah,
that's a scary
like
statement.
Blackadder or something.
Yes, essentially Blackadder, but even less competent and more but less competent and with an enormous amount of luck that Blackadder never had. So where everything goes wrong for Blackadder, it all goes right for Flashman. So Flashman makes it through 60 years in the British Army.
Wow.
But anyway, the main point is that because he's funny, you laugh at what he's saying, so you go, yes, he's an absolute bastard, but I want to read more because it's funny and it's amusing. And because you have a positive emotional response while reading the book, you have a positive emotional response towards the character. That's very basic, simple, way oversimplified psychology, but it's kind of true in a helpful sense rather than an accurate sense.
I still mostly wanted him to die, but given it was his memoirs...
Yeah, and the idea is that it's all written from his perspective because it's supposedly his memoirs.
Well, his private memoirs, yes.
Not so private anymore, though.
But yeah, it's a good example then of a character that you don't hate. Like, Joffrey is a character you hate, whereas this is a character who you acknowledge is evil. So Jaime Lannister is not a nice guy, could never be acknowledged as a nice guy. He threw a kid out the fucking window.
No, he threw a kid out the window first.
This. He also betrayed his king, stabbed him, and threw his children under the mountain. but
arguably in a nice way, but sorry.
no, not in a nice way.
To save his father from being slaughtered by the king he was killing. Or...
And
people.
That
Alright,
is
enough. We
disputed.
shouldn't
Wasn't that
argue about this.
That
We're
is
into, like
that
fans
the
versus.
canonical status of that is questioned.
Wait, but like we shouldn't.
Anyway,
Next week, I'm arguing Game of Thrones.
the main point is that you would have to say he's not actually nice.
Yeah.
However, he's funny, he has style, he's good looking, and you can thus enjoy watching Jamie, whereas you just want to see Joffrey die in a horrible, horrible manner, and it is so satisfying when you see him choke and cough up blood.
We're all waiting for Jamie to backhand someone to.
Oh my god, the backhand! Oh,
yes. So I think that's probably what happens with Flashman, is that rather than a character you hate, it's a character that you enjoy. Much the same way that you enjoy reading about Peter Baelish, even though he's creepy. Creepy.
Yes.
But awesome, yes, but creepy.
Alright then.
Okay, can we break up and then just start discussing Game of Thrones?
Yep.
we reconvene for official Game of Thrones discussion next week.
One more thing. Not to do with my talk. We are looking for a lot more speakers through the rest of the semester. You've seen two different styles of how this can be done tonight. I started with a small piece of Game of Thrones and then springboarded into social theory with glorious abandon and snarky comments, aviated by the floor. Sarah went through a movie in much more detail on how you can actually analyse what is being said, how does this relate to your discipline. If you think this would be fun to do, and it is fun, then please...
It actually is.
It is enormous fun, and it doesn't take an enormous amount of preparation.
You can write it in less than a day. I've done it.
But either way, it's a lot of fun, and basically take something you know about already. Use a movie, a book, a TV series, a small part of that as a springboard to get into what you love. Or go through the book or TV series in more detail, and talk to us about it. We'll enjoy it because it's something cool. There's a reason that you enjoy it. And we really would like speakers. Come talk to Claire, Mark, or myself.
Or Facebook us.
Our contact details are on our website, or via the many forms of Facebook, where again our contact details are available. We are looking for a lot more speakers. Please get in touch with us.
Please go and watch The Mummy and keep what I said in mind. The facial expressions.
And anyone who's interested in more of these, there are videos from last semester's course. They're finally fixed, so you can check out the XSA website to see those.
Those were introduction to everything rather than popcorn pundit, so they're much more general discussions of disciplines.
But still just as snarky.
Yes.
And a lot of fun. It's been great to see a really big turnout tonight. I hope to
We
see you
always
all
have
on
fun.
Facebook.
Yay!